So this morning, what I want to talk about are kind of previous issues in ethics and research and some of the current issues that we have that communities are struggling with. Some of these issues, things were because it was a different time and good came out of it. In other instances, a lot of really bad things happened. And then the decision moving forward is, how are we going to address these issues moving forward? And kind of the current to this talk is, with all of our conversations about diversity and inclusion and equity in clinical trials, not to mention healthcare in general, how do we talk to communities of color with the history that we have? And, you know, once you kind of familiarize yourself with things outside of the big ones like Tuskegee, with what history is, it makes perfect sense to me why people of color are like, yeah, no, thanks. Y'all have fun with that. Because we have exploited, and I mean, it's a worldwide phenomenon, but in this country, you know, Black and brown people have been exploited right and left in healthcare and in clinical research. And kind of, as we start this conversation, how do we want to re-engage these communities? So we're going to start with a woman that I find fascinating, and her name is Henrietta Lacks. And Henrietta Lacks went to Johns Hopkins in 1951. She was from Baltimore, for cervical cancer. And she had like these super ninja killer cervical cancer cells. And when they removed it, they sent a tissue sample to Dr. George Gee, who cultured them as they had done with every other cervical cancer patient, because they were trying to culture and grow cells outside of the body. And they'd been attempting this for 30 years and they failed miserably until they got the HeLa cells. And her cells were like supernatural cells and very aggressive. They replicated 20 to 24 hours, leading them to be dubbed immortal. Her impact on healthcare and on the advances in medicine in the last 70 years really cannot be overstated. Now, they are the most widely used human cell line in the world. Those cells have been commercialized, but they've never been practiced. Now, in 1951, we didn't really do consent. They just took tissue. And to be honest, even in this day, if your tissue is de-identified, they can take it, which I have a huge problem with, but we'll discuss that in a minute. So it is said that the cells have had an impact on every living human being on the planet who was born after like 1954. One scientist estimated that if you combined all of the HeLa cells that were ever grown and you put them on a scale, they'd weigh more than 55 million tons, which is a number I can't get my brain around if stuff is heavy like it's whales, much less something as small as a single cell. Another scientist calculated that if you could lay all of the HeLa cells end to end, they would circumnavigate the globe 3 times, which again, for something that is microscopic, that's a really whole lot of cells that have been used. Her impacts on healthcare: polio vaccine, TB, herpes, flu vaccines, HPV vaccine, the COVID vaccine. They were the first cells to go into outer space to see how zero gravity would affect them. They've been used in genome mapping, in vitro fertilization, HIV and AIDS treatments, Parkinson's, chemo, and leukemia treatments. I mean, there's just a wide breadth of healthcare that her cells have had a real influence on. The ethical issues, and kind of when we talk about systemic racism and inequities, this is really a holdover. In 1951, the US was still largely segregated. Johns Hopkins at the time was one of the few academic institutions that would even see, much less treat, a Black woman. They treated her, and they treated other African Americans, but it was still in a segregated environment. No informed consent was obtained to get these cells, and this was decades before the Belmont report would change everything around consent and permission. And as I said earlier, it is still legal today to remove your tissue and give it to someone if it's de-identified. But my question to that is, how do you de-identify DNA? If they have your tissue, they have your DNA, and you can tell a whole lot about a person, as y'all know, based on their DNA, and who knows what they'll be able to tell you in another 20 or 30 years. So I got a problem with that. We got to fix that. So Johns Hopkins' response to what happened with these cells and their kind of role in distributing these cells, they have gone to great lengths to really publicize her legacy. They've worked with her family. They actually admit that they should have and could have done better by this family and by her. They never patented these cells, and they say that they have never made money from her cells. This is kind of really one of those areas where I have a whole lot of problems with people not obtaining consent, but at that time that was not done. I think Johns Hopkins has taken steps to really try to atone for what they've done and for the distribution of these cells without her permission or her family's permission. Pharmaceutical companies, not so much. The ones who have really profited on her cells are, a lot of big pharma. On October 4th, last month, the Lax estate sued a biotechnology company 51 years to the date of her death. And, they want people to stop using her cells without permission. Not entirely sure how that's going to happen, given how many of these cells are out. But this is an issue I think that pharma and that science really have to make right. The second issue that we have, and I want to set the ground rules here. Our relationship with the public, kind of the scientific community at large, is really based on trust. And while actual fraud is very, very rare, the impact that it can have is apocalyptic. And that's what we're going to get into next. And I actually worked in the bone marrow program when this little thermonuclear device went off. And you want to talk about the entire landscape of something changing in a 24-hour period. It was what Werner Bayswater did to advance cancer, breast cancer, and bone marrow transplant program in women. Then in 1995, he released a paper that showed that 51% of the women that he had given really high dose chemotherapy to, and then followed up with a stem cell transplant, had a survival rate of 51%, and the control arm having a survival rate of 2%. These numbers were off the chart, and researchers everywhere were like, wow, what is he doing that is giving all this benefit to these women? Because nobody else was getting results like this in the studies that they were doing. But it was published in JAMA, in the Journal of Clinical Oncology. There it was in black and white that he was actually getting results like this for women who had, node positive or metastatic breast cancer. The article was kind of so groundbreaking that he was invited to present at ASCO in 1999 in Atlanta, and the plenary session was attended by about 20,000 people. Bayswater data found that about 60% of his patients were still alive, and 20% in the control arm were alive. So there's a big difference there. He presented his data in the morning. The data in the afternoon was presented by the NIH, and they presented 3 studies, and their results were dismal. There was no benefit. One of the studies they closed mid-study because the toxicity and the deaths were so bad and the mortality. So because of kind of the diametric opposition of these two findings, a group of American scientists were like, we'd really like to go over to Africa and see what he's doing and look at his records so that we can design a trial that will confirm his results. Upon their arrival, the auditors wanted to look at the logbooks for the 154 patients that Bayswater reported had. He gave them a logbook for 58 and said that the rest had been lost. The auditors concluded that Bayswater had lied about the study and about 9 other protocols that he had submitted to the IRB. They had never been reviewed. The study that his results were based on wasn't even written until 1999, a couple of months before the auditors arrived. The auditors scoured the medical records from 2 different hospitals. They reviewed 15,000 patients in search for the records of the 90 people that they could not identify or that were not on the logs. The auditors found records for 61 of those participants, and of those, only 27 were documented clearly enough that it established that the patient was even eligible for the study. Of the 27 that were sufficiently documented, 18 were clearly not eligible. Only 25 seemed to have received the therapy that they had been assigned. And of the patients that were on study, all of them except 3 were on the high-dose chemotherapy transplant group. Bayswater had reported that there had been no deaths as a result of his treatment, and the auditors found that that was also not true, and that 3 women had likely died of related deaths. In the end, they could only document that 7 women were still alive. The number of women who have been treated by Dr. Bayswater is not known. When you consider how expensive a bone marrow transplant is in the 90s, the standard therapy for stage 4 breast cancer was $15,000 to $40,000. High-dose chemo with a BMT is $70,000 to $150,000. 11 days after this fraud was reported, the New York Times published that Aetna would no longer cover high-dose chemotherapy and BMT for women with advanced cancer. The other thing, and this is what kind of really galls me, is that there were no consents for these women. Most of these studies were conducted between 1990 and 1995 at Hillbrow Hospital, which was a hospital for poor, mostly Black patients during the period of apartheid in South Africa. Bayswater, really took advantage of women who were poor, illiterate, and had very little understanding of their cancer, much less of the treatment that they were being asked to sign up for. So when this went off, Elizabeth Spall was the associate director of the bone marrow transplant program, and she really believed in bone marrow transplant for women with advanced breast cancer. And it was devastating to her. And I'm sure many other oncologists who had been treating women with this treatment, that they had quoted his study as effective and had convinced women to go on study based on his false data. I honestly think if she had gotten her hands on him, she would have cut his heart out with a butter knife. And that might be generous. In the end, there are some red flags that we should have been aware of. How did he find 154 women who agreed to go on this? Because I'm telling you, these chemo cocktails, they were intense, and they have serious cardiac issues, mortality. I mean, high-dose chemotherapy is not for the faint of heart. And I mean, the women on the unit that I was on the unit, it was the real suffering, is how I will leave it. They believe that about 30,000 women were put on this therapy based on his original 1995 article, and that between 4,000 and 9,000 likely died from the side effects. Based on the positive results of the report that did from 1995, the University of Washington in Seattle designed 2 clinical trials to try to replicate what Bayswater had done in South Africa. 6 patients went on the study, and then the trial was abandoned because 4 patients experienced such intense cardiac toxicity. 2 died from cardiomyopathy, and the other 2 had to have permanent cardiac follow-up and care because of the damage that was done to their heart. The one good thing that you could say that came out of this is that it really strengthened the argument for an international registry of randomized trials. So now, we have clinicaltrials.gov. Most countries require that clinical trials to a national registry so that people can look and see how many patients have you accrued. We can kind of look at your interim analysis, and we kind of know what's going on. Accountability. There really was none. He lost his job at the university. He was never prosecuted. He was never brought up on charges. According to his LinkedIn page, he's still practicing medicine in Johannesburg. I will tell you that from my experience, and I was the regulatory affairs manager for the bone marrow transplant program at the time, the bottom fell out of the program for breast cancer in a week. And it should have, based on false information. But again, accountability, transparency, integrity, and honesty really matter when we look at clinical trials and when we look at how we treat people. All right, so I'm going to give y'all a second. Any questions, comments? This is what I hate about Zoom. Y'all are also quiet.
No questions so far.
Okay. All right. So now we're going to kind of go into what I see as one of the kind of big current issues that we need to apply some brain cells to. And that is the globalization of clinical trials and who benefits from the globalization of clinical trials. How and where is the potential for exploitation of poor people? And if we run these trials, are we going to be able to replicate them anywhere in the world? So the trend for the last 15 to 20 years has really been toward going into low and middle income countries to do clinical trials. This is Russia, China, India, the continent of Africa, South America, Poland, Eastern Europe. And I have no problem with that. And I'll be honest, I have no problem with big pharma making boatloads of money. That's fine with me. What I'm not okay with is doing it on the backs of poor Black and brown people. It can be done ethically. We just have to make the commitment to do it. And kind of in my way of thinking, we can, I think most of us, 99% of us can say, yes, we want to conduct clinical trials ethically in emerging economies. That's easy. But that decision doesn't really get made as a single decision. It gets made in the day-to-day decisions that we make in how we treat people, how we include people, and how we support people. So the move to emerging economies is it is both economic and clinical. It's a lot cheaper. There's a lot less oversight. And in places like India, which is going to be kind of the country that I focus on, you have a whole lot of people. I mean, there are a whole lot of people who live in India. And so they can find people who are willing to set up and be part of these clinical trials, and they can do it a lot less expensively. But what kind of happens is in India, when you're looking at a society that's based on the caste system, and the lowest of the low are the ones that these companies are going to try to recruit, it becomes an issue because, well, let me back up. I'm going to get to that in the next slide. I'm getting ahead of myself. So when we start looking at clinical trials moving out of kind of the developed world, when you look at the registry between 2011 and 2020, 28,000 clinical trials were registered in India, and 7,400 of those were registered in 2020 alone. Indian women in particular are under a lot of pressure to participate in these trials because they carry a greater return financially than many of the other jobs that most women can hold in India. I think things get really complicated when you're talking about consent, and the consent has to be translated into the language that the subject speaks. Being in the caste system, being given medical care when you are at the bottom of that system is a real honor and is not to be questioned. So it's easy to enroll patients in places like India who are willing to participate, especially when they're poor. And this may be their only access to healthcare. So when we get into issues around the Declaration of Helsinki and ICH harmonization, we run into issues around defining standard of care. And the ICH guidelines say that you use the standard of care that's available in the community. Well, if there's no standard of care available in that community, how do you assess for a standard of care? And so no standard of care is really not an option. And then treating these people over a period of time for whatever the condition that they have, and then going, thank you, see ya, we're leaving now, I don't think is really an option. And they have possibly benefited from your drug or whatever it is you're testing, and now you're going to leave them and they can't afford it. I got a really big problem with that. So what I'm hoping is that we're not exporting all of the suffering and importing all of the benefit, is kind of what I'm saying. So in terms of moving forward, what do we do? And like I said before, I think we can all make a big decision about how, of course, we want to treat people ethically and we don't want to exploit people. But that decision is not a single decision. It's a decision that is made day to day to day to day in terms of how you treat people. And I'll be really honest, a lot of y'all are going to go on to industry. That's great. But when you go to industry, look farther than the marketing in terms of how decisions are being made. What are the financial incentives? And are they really making decisions based on what is going to benefit the patients, or are they really making decisions in terms of squeezing every dollar out? Because in my mind, the ends do not justify the means. You can't conduct clinical trials over people who are poor just because you want the benefit. In terms of kind of our more local kind of efforts to recruit more minorities and more underserved people, I think there's a whole spectrum of things that we should look at. We need to look at building a more diverse healthcare workforce, from one end to the other, from administrators and MAs to nurses to physicians, the whole gambit. We need really to diversify the workforce in healthcare. We need to build long-lasting relationships with our patients and our subjects and go out to them. We need to go to the communities, to the churches, and to the neighborhoods. We need to engage them. We should not wait for them to come to us. And lastly, pharma can't ghost a community once the research is complete. I think there's an expectation for the care that has been provided to the point of study closure should continue after that, because I think you have opened, an avenue for patients to receive care that should be sustained. And I think if it is true that the arc of time bends towards justice, it's up to all of us to add what little weight we can to that arc, or for some of us, who are heavyweights, to push towards that arc to make it bend faster. Do y'all have questions, comments?
I have a question. Oh, there's somebody else have a question. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Okay, so when you were talking about in India and how, sorry, there's some noise in the background, but let me back up a little bit. So when I worked at UCLA, and it was very similar to CU Denver, where you have a lot more patients who have a lot more money and aren't really suffering. And because now I work at Denver Health, we see a lot more of these patients who don't have money and who, as Dr. Okiyama says, their last worry in their life is cancer. They have so many other things to worry about before. And I know when I was at UCLA, they decided in oncology, we're not going to pay patients anymore to be a part of clinical trials because it's not ethical. Are they just trying to be a part of the study to get this money? But now I find here in Colorado that there are a lot more studies are like, we will pay you $250 a visit to come and be a part of the study. And so it's kind of this weird line of, like this, is it ethical to pay these patients?
Yeah.
They're suffering, how some of them can't even get to our clinic, for all these visits. So it's this weird place. So how do you justify what's ethical and what's not?
So that is a really, really good question. And I think, when you go back and you look at places like, Denver Health or India or, large swaths of Africa, Russia, China, these people aren't trying to figure out how they're going to pay for their chemo. They're trying to find clean water and food and basic things of survival that we would never consider in our day-to-day life. I mean, if we want clean water, we can usually find it. And I say that, and I mean, my brain is going Flint, Michigan, Flint, Michigan, Flint, Michigan. But the challenges that we face are nothing compared to what Denver Health faces. And I mean, it was actually a conversation that you and I had that really kind of sparked my interest in kind of looking at this on kind of a larger global scale, because when you talk about enrolling patients on clinical trials, okay, great. But for us, we don't have so many issues with transportation. I mean, a lot of people don't have cars. They have to take a bus. They're not going to feel good. Are they being paid or not being paid? We at Anschutz don't offer money for clinical trials, to my knowledge. And we're trying hard to do things like transportation and housing. But we've got a lot of work to do there too. And I think the issue around paying people, because you don't want people signing up for a clinical trial just in order to get the income which they desperately need. So we don't pay them. And
I didn't know that you went. I thought we were both kind of doing, I thought it was a Colorado thing. So but no, thank you for.
Anschutz does not, because we do that. We see that as a type of coercion.
I understand.
Okay. Other questions, comments?
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Marie, I think one thing that I'll chime in on from North's perspective on this, we've struggled with this quite a bit in terms of whether or not to pay research participants because of the exact reasons that are being discussed. But one of the things that we struggle with is, how do we handle it when the research study requires more transportation efforts by the participant than what they would have had in the standard of care setting? So if they're having to come in for extra visits for PK draws, we would like to compensate them for that. But obviously adding the compensation, comes with a whole list of legal complications and regulatory requirements, and all of those things that make it a challenge.
I'm going to wander off here into some of the ancient history of my career, and you run up against all kinds of regulations that say no. And I think most of those regulations are well-intended, but I also think there should be room there to help people receive the treatment that they need. And I'm just not sure how to balance that. But I do agree that when they're being asked to come in for additional visits and for additional imaging and stuff like that, that there should be compensation for their travel. I don't think they should be paid to participate, but I think they should be reimbursed for the travel, especially if it's outside of standard of care. Yes, this is true. Some trials do pay participants, but they're not in oncology. Like if you're a healthy volunteer and you're going to take my time, you bet you're going to pay me for my time. That's totally what you're going to be doing. But oncology is, again, quite different. And so I speak very specifically to oncology. Okay. Any other questions, comments? Oh, come on, guys. Somebody's got something to say. Really? Okay. Well, that didn't take long.
I've got a quick question I just thought of.
Sure.
First of all, thanks for the talk.
Okay.
But I was kind of been thinking about if you or anyone else can speak to kind of the tone or the discussion with sponsors from pharmaceutical companies and how willing they are to reimburse for some of these expenses that patients come up against. Are they more willing? Are some more willing than others? What's kind of the general theme there?
Hey, Tiffany Colvin, I'm going to ask you to chime in here since everything I do is NCI based. And I know the rules of the NCI, but I don't necessarily know all the rules for big pharma. Are you still on?
I am still on.
Thank you.
Yeah. Can you elaborate a little bit sort of more on that question though for me?
Sure.
Yeah.
Hi, Tiffany. I'm just wondering, as far as individual pharmaceutical companies, if there's a difference between how willing they are to reimburse. It sounds like sometimes we'll submit for reimbursements and there's only a certain portion covered, whereas I'm just not sure if there's any budgetary issues there, or if certain companies are more willing to provide reimbursement.
Yeah, so I think when we look at reimbursement, there's two different components, right? So I think there is sort of the travel reimbursement or the overnight stay or food stipends for the day of treatment. And then, right, there's just the reimbursement of just sort of overall, right, just more procedures. I think we do see if there is a rationale provided to industry sponsors for them to cover travel reimbursement and food stipends or overnight lodging. What looks different is some sponsors maybe are going to be like, that's for you and right, your caregiver, or it's only for the patient. So you can see some discrepancies there between what they're willing to provide. They may say only up to so many patients, which then we can't then do it for any patient, right? Because it has to be available to everyone. So you sometimes see different pieces, or maybe they'll say, right, we'll provide this reimbursement for patients that are traveling 100 miles or greater. So it really depends on the sponsor, but yes, I think they are willing to sort of expand their catchment and focus on patients that need those resources. There is a lot of, right, just regulatory and compliance components and just equity pieces that we have to be really mindful of when putting those into our consents and speaking with the patients. And it takes a lot of legwork as far as then just getting that right money to the patient. And so some sponsors utilize cards for the patients, where others, right, come through the department and we sort of have to manage that, which right, just keeping all of that really straight is a lot. As far as just procedures, I think in the oncology space, you don't really see any additional reimbursement on anything that would be deemed billable to third party and right SOC through the MCA. We've seen that really over the last 15 years change, right, in the landscape, where before everything would go to the sponsor. And we are not able to, I think, get a lot of additional income for patients within that space. But I do think it is growing. And I think it also depends, is it right, large pharma versus a biotech that has just started. But I think it is always worth asking if your catchment is a large area, just to see what they are willing to provide. And sometimes you can counter a certain amount to say, hey, can we up that by $50 or some stuff, right? Because we know a hotel doesn't even cost what they're going to cover, right? So, there are things that you can do depending upon what the catchment is, and then what the resources are to provide that. Again, when you're providing a consent to someone, you don't want them to choose, right, one trial over the other because this trial offers, right, travel. And so that still comes back to, how do we provide these resources across the board to all patients, to where that's not what is their deciding factor, especially if they're leaning towards the one that doesn't have travel reimbursement. And so you just have to keep those things in mind as well too, when you're looking at your portfolio and who's offering what. I hope that answers.
Yeah, thank you for commenting on that. I was just wondering if there's any kind of standard agreement that we offer as a site, kind of to every pharmaceutical company, if that would be an option going forward. But there's more to it than I realized. So thanks for speaking to that.
Yeah, of course. I think that'd be a great thing to sort of move towards. We have tried that in the past historically, and we have not been very successful. So I will say that is something at one point, right, we did look into in order to sort of align things. And it did not take off for various reasons.
Yeah, and I think Tiffany brings up a really important point here, in that, we have these conversations and they're ongoing conversations. And, I think as an institution remaining persistent in our advocating for our subjects is always a good thing. And I think just because you're told no once doesn't mean you don't circle back around and ask again later. I mean, I think about things over the course of my career that were, considered intrusions. I start with, my dad hated Ralph Nader, who was a safety expert in the 1960s and 70s. And, wanted seatbelts in all cars. Well, that's just going to increase the cost of a car. Well, really it's safety. And now I'm like, I wouldn't get in a car without buckling my seatbelt for love nor money. And I certainly wouldn't put my kid in my car without putting him in a seatbelt. And then I think about in the 1980s, when PPE was starting to be used across healthcare because of the AIDS crisis. And oh my God, there were people in the practice that I was in at the time who were just livid that the federal government and OSHA would tell them that they have to wear gloves. And today, if somebody came at me without a pair of gloves on and a needle, I think I'd run. And so I think what gets resistance in the beginning, if we kind of continue to work on this and we continue to cultivate the ground on this, we will make progress here. I mean, when you look at somebody like Henrietta Lacks, no consent, a lot of things done without permission, and you look at how far we've come today, I mean, we really have made an enormous amount of progress, but you really have to look over the long haul. And it really is the decisions that we make and the advocacy that we do on a day-to-day basis that pushes the change. I do want to ask Christine a question. I mean, you and I talked, It's been a few months ago. Can you tell the group, because most of this group is at Anschutz, North, South. I've got some mountain sites on the VA, although the VA is certainly different from kind of the Anschutz population, but would you really kind of speak to the barriers that your population sees beyond just transportation? Because I found a lot of that really insightful, that in our own local communities, the kind of things that you see on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, sure. I think Dr. Okayama that I work for has a really great vision for the patients at Denver Health. They are really struggling, and if you've ever come out to our hospital, and you have, Marie, there are people hanging around the hospital who are, homeless or, suffering from mental illness and having an episode in front of our office, in front of the hospital that I work for, or the office that I'm at. I think it comes down to, like you touched light on a little bit, is these patients are struggling with, hey, I don't have enough money to pay for my rent, and I was at a certain hospital. Now they sent me to Denver Health, and please help us. Please help me. I think, I don't know, my heart goes out to them, right? It's just, they're dealing a rough hand. And I think, I'm just really proud to work for Dr. Okayama, because she's doing so much good for these people who are coming to her, who are saying, hey, maybe I'm an illegal patient. Can I still get care? And it does take a loss to the hospital, but we're still treating them, right? It's like, okay, your legal status doesn't matter here. You're still going to get cancer treatment, or, we'll figure out a way to pay for your Uber ride, so you're not taking the bus when you're feeling horrible after your cancer treatment. But I'm just really, I don't want to bore everybody, but I'm really happy to be a part of something that has a bigger, like it's this bigger, I don't want to say mission, but it's just giving back to
you
the
can say
community.
mission. You can say
Okay.
mission.
Thank you, Marie. I appreciate you. But I just, and Dr. Okayama always says, like, hey, in your lifespan, when you're on your deathbed, like, when you look back at what have you done for society, or what were you part of, something that was bigger that helped those in need? And I'm like, yeah, that's a great point. I love her morals about that. So, but yeah, that was it. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you, Christine. And I think, before we kind of wrap up here, I mean, gosh, the last 18 months, they have been really, really hard. I mean, you know, how we do our job, everything has been kind of upended and turned upside down. And I really want to express my gratitude to all of you for the hard work that you've put in, whether you've been here 3 months helping us dig out from this, or whether you've been here for the whole thing. You know, I really appreciate everybody's dedication and determination. And I've talked to some of y'all over the last month or two, kind of in smaller settings or one-on-one. And as Colorado is not in a great spot at all, I'd like for you to remember 3 things. Be persistent, take small steps every day forward, be really patient, have lots of patience with one another, with your colleagues and your peers, and really find a depth and resource for a sense of humor so that we can all kind of get on the other side of everything that we're dealing with and trying to manage our way through. And if you need help, ask for it. So anybody else got questions? Do I have any more chat? No. Okay. Any other comments or questions?
I just wanted to say thank you so much, Maria. I think you do a great job of speaking about all this. The slides were amazing. I really appreciate I love like historical
thank you.
facts like this. But thank you so much. And thank you for not talking like a robot. I have a hard time on calls when people talk like robots. I'm like, I didn't understand what you said. I need you to, I don't know. So I appreciate you. Thank you.
I don't know how to talk any other way. So I mean, I talk to the computer the same way I talk to people. I don't know what that says about me, but it's like I imagine all of y'all out there, and that, you know, I'm actually talking to you like we're all sitting here in my living room, even though we're not. But thank you, because it has terrified me all week. I mean, I have not slept all week, being like, oh my God, how are we going to do this on Zoom with all these people? But you know, we'll get through it. And I think the rest of the speakers probably have a lot more experience doing this on Zoom to large crowds than I do. I think, you know, I really miss kind of the networking that we could all do together from across all of the different sites that I have and that I say grace over. But that just wasn't going to happen this year. So I am going to stop the recording now and we can take a break. Oh, somebody said something. Oh, you're welcome, Catherine. So let's see. Dr. Henry, are you ready?
Yeah, I can go now if we want to start early.
Yeah, sure. All right, let's start.
If you stop sharing, I'll share my presentation.